Why is that
Well,
necessary?
so if God doesn't exist, what's wrong with suffering? Like, is it bad if mosquitoes suffer? Or are you just arbitrarily choosing human suffering?
Unnecessary suffering is bad. So if there is a God that created this universe, that creates everything in it, and is all-knowing, then he created suffering for a reason. So if there is a God, he's a mean God. So he shouldn't get our respect.
So if God doesn't exist, if we evolved out of stardust, and basically if suffering is simply chemical reactions and neurons firing in the brain, then why would that be? Like, why? Of course, it's unpleasant. People don't want it.
Right.
But where do you get morality at that point?
Why does morality have to come from suffering?
Well, a lot of people argue that we should treat people in a certain manner because suffering's bad. So, of course, we can all agree that suffering is unpleasant and we don't like it. But if you're an atheist and reject that God exists, you don't have any weight behind any argument you give for why people shouldn't have suffering inflicted upon them. So your worldview is morally bankrupt at that point.
You're not morally bankrupt. You should see suffering and try to improve it yourself.
Why?
You shouldn't accept that suffering happens because God decided that that's what it is. Wars and famine and sickness and illness. Why does that have to exist? If it exists and you believe in God, then you believe that God created it. Therefore, God is mean and God is wrong, and you shouldn't protect that God.
But who are you to judge God?
Then suffering happens because it's part of this universe that is created and is random and doesn't have any specific point.
And if God doesn't exist, how can you condemn someone who inflicts suffering on somebody else?
You can, because
why is that wrong?
You can tell right from wrong. If somebody inflicts suffering,
that's your opinion, but somebody else could have a different opinion, right? The person who's inflicting the suffering could say that gives them pleasure, right?
But it's a collective feeling of humans that suffering is wrong, right?
But they could think their own suffering is wrong, but they could seek to alleviate their own suffering by causing somebody else to suffer in the way that they want them to suffer.
Well, so how do you,
according to your opinion, but there's no way to say objectively that they're wrong. All that you can say is that you don't like what they're doing, but they could say they do like what they're doing and they don't like you telling them that they're wrong. So how do you know who's right and how do you know who's wrong in that worldview?
Society. I mean,
well, who determines that?
4,000 years when people were, doing other things that weren't socially acceptable today, then that was what was socially acceptable then.
So are you saying that morality is determined by social norms?
Yes.
So if it's the social, what if it was the social norm in America today to treat black people like animals? Would that make it okay because it was the social norm? So then morality isn't determined by social norms.
It is.
Is it or is not? You seem to be contradicting yourself.
I'm not contradicting myself. The fact that we had slavery in this country, 100 years ago, and literally only got over some of it in the last few decades, doesn't mean that it was right.
So how do you know that it's wrong?
Because we evolved.
But how do you know that we evolved in the right direction? How do you know which is the right direction to go? Who's right and who's wrong? Because there's so many different opinions about what should happen and what shouldn't happen. Some people think that slavery is great. Other people think it's terrible. Who's right and who's wrong? And how do you know?
Slavery is great.
The people who had slaves.
Yes, that was
the people who enslaved the Africans. They thought it was great. And they thought the African suffering didn't matter that much or didn't matter. They didn't care about the suffering because they thought thought that they could avoid suffering by enslaving people.
No,
and it just all you end up
suffering by enslaving other people. They just were racist and thought that those people were less than them.
Yeah, well, it is a very minor form of suffering.
Of Christianity that brought that along.
No. The Christianity teaches that everybody's created in the image of God and therefore has equal value. But if God doesn't exist, all your
Christians, they
claim to be.
Portugal and Spain.
They claim to be. They were false converts. They weren't real Christians. No real Christian would do that.
Anyway, most of the wars in this world happen, in the name of a God most of the suffering in this world is unnecessary, and we do evolve. So we accepted slavery 100 years ago, and we don't accept it today.
And so,
It's not that God changed our mind over 100 years. Social norms changed.
but it's only your opinion that we evolved in the right direction, because people who like slavery could say that we evolved in the wrong direction, and we
like
didn't evolve in the right
slavery
way.
Who thinks that slavery is good today?
People who own slaves think it's good.
But that isn't going on
There's
today.
there's people who think
There
that
are
rape is
people
good
around
because
the
they
world.
commit rape. There's people who think that rape is good and they commit rape.
and do
So
you
who's
think
right and
they're
who's
right?
wrong? No, they're
They're
wrong
wrong.
because God says they're wrong.